Picture this: the royal chambers of a medieval palace, lit by the flicker of dozens of candles. The air is heavy with incense, the sweet smoke clinging to every surface. At the center stands a bath carved from marble, and inside it swirls not water, but a glittering metal that moves like liquid silver. Courtiers gather in silence as the queen herself steps forward, lowering her hand into the strange pool. She believes this ritual will guard her beauty against the passage of time. Her servants whisper that her skin glows brighter after every bath, that she has discovered the secret of eternal youth. But the truth is far darker. Every shimmering drop sliding across her skin is a poison creeping through her veins. This is not fantasy. For centuries, across empires and dynasties, rulers and nobles turned to Mercury, what alchemists called liquid silver, as the ultimate beauty ritual. They swallowed it in elixirs, painted it across their faces, powdered their cheeks with it, and in the most chilling accounts, bathed in it. They believed this dazzling substance carried the power of transformation, the very essence of immortality. After all, Mercury was unlike anything else. It moved like a living thing, reflecting light with a brilliance no gemstone could match. To touch it was to touch eternity. But beneath the shimmer lay one of the deadliest poisons known to humankind. Slowly, invisibly, Mercury unraveled the body. It began with trembling hands and restless nights. Then came sores on the skin, teeth that blackened and fell out, hair coming loose in handfuls. And worst of all, the mind itself began to fracture paranoia, hallucinations, sudden rages. Yet the cruelest irony was that many mistook these symptoms for simple aging. Believing their youth was slipping away, they doubled their efforts, painting thicker layers, drinking stronger doses, seeking salvation in the very poison that consumed them. To understand why queens, empresses, and noblewomen risked everything for such dangerous rituals, we need to step back. In the world of the past, beauty was never just vanity, it was survival. A queen's youth meant power, fertility, political strength, even divine favor. To age was to weaken, to lose influence, to risk being discarded. And so, in their desperate battle against time, these women reached for the glittering promise of Mercury, never realizing it would hasten their destruction. In the courts of medieval Europe, in the palaces of China, in the harems of the Islamic world, beauty was never just a matter of vanity. It was power. A queen's youth was more than skin deep. It symbolized fertility, divine favor, and political stability. To look young and radiant was to reassure allies and intimidate rivals. Wrinkles and gray hair, by contrast, could be seen as signs of weakness, decay, and approaching death. For women at the very top of society, appearance was as much a weapon as any sword or army. Imagine the pressure. Every noble marriage was a contract, a treaty, a fragile balance of power. A princess chosen for her beauty might secure a dynasty. An aging queen could be replaced by a younger rival. The survival of entire kingdoms sometimes rested on how youthful and desirable a woman appeared to be. Courtiers praised queens in poems, portraits, and songs, but beneath the flattery lay cruel judgment. One wrinkle, one blemish, could shift alliances. This obsession with appearance only grew stronger in cultures where rulers were considered chosen by the gods. In China, the emperor's consort was seen as a reflection of heavenly order. In Europe, the beauty of a queen was interpreted as a sign of God's blessing upon her reign. Even the Church, which preached humility, held up images of the Virgin Mary as an ideal of eternal youth and purity, creating impossible standards for mortal women to live up to. Faced with such pressure, noblewomen turned to whatever means promised to preserve their looks. Oils and herbs, imported perfumes, secret ointments from faraway lands. And when these failed, they turned to alchemists. These mysterious men promised more than cosmetics. They promised transformation. If base metals could be turned into gold, if mortal flesh could be infused with eternal vitality, then perhaps beauty itself could be made immortal. It was in this climate of desperation and hope that Mercury, the strange metal that flowed like liquid and glowed like silver, found its place as the ultimate weapon against time. Courtiers and physicians alike whispered that it carried divine energy, that it was the very essence of the moon and stars. And queens, caught in the cruel game of politics and beauty, embraced it. They did not see poison. They saw salvation. Long before queens bathed in mercury, the substance fascinated alchemists and healers across the world. In ancient China, red cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury sulfide, was ground into powders and mixed into creams, elixirs, and cosmetics. It was brilliant and bright, a color that symbolized life and vitality. Court ladies dusted it onto their cheeks, and emperors consumed it in potions said to grant immortality. Chinese texts describe cinnabar as a bridge between the human body and the divine, a substance that could purify the soul while preserving youth. The irony, of course, was that every dose brought its users closer to a painful death. In the Islamic Golden Age, Persian and Arab alchemists studied mercury as part of their quest for transformation. They called it the spirit of silver and believed it held the secret to changing base metals into gold. More than a metal, it was thought to be alive, forever shifting and moving. This gave it a kind of mystical status. Physicians experimented with it in medicines, often unaware of its toxic effects. To nobles desperate for eternal life, mercury seemed a gift from heaven itself. Europe, too, inherited this fascination. Medieval scholars, influenced by Arabic texts, began experimenting with mercury in their own laboratories. They saw it as one of the primal elements, a material that could embody both male and female qualities, both solid and liquid. This strange duality made it an attractive ingredient for beauty rituals. By the Renaissance, women of high rank were dusting their faces with lead-based powders mixed with traces of mercury, believing the shimmering white would erase any flaw. The smoother and paler the skin, the closer one appeared to the divine ideal of beauty. Mercury's allure was not just practical. It was symbolic. Unlike other metals, it did not rust, tarnish, or decay. It flowed endlessly, reflecting light like a mirror. To a world terrified of aging, this seemed like a promise. If mercury never changed, then perhaps those who used it would remain unchanged as well. Every drop in a potion, every smear on the skin, carried with it the dream of cheating time. But beneath the surface, the poison was already at work, eroding bodies and minds in the cruelest possible way. Nowhere was the obsession with mercury more striking than in imperial China. For centuries, emperors and empresses consumed it in the hope of prolonging life. The most infamous case is Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He was so terrified of death that he drank immortality elixirs laced with mercury. And it is widely believed that this very quest hastened his death at the age of 49. If the emperor himself risked such poisons, imagine the pressure on women in the court to maintain their youth and vitality by similar means. Legends speak of the great Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China in her own name, who was said to have relied on secret potions of cinnabar to preserve her appearance. Chroniclers, writing decades after her death, described her as still radiant in her 60s, attributing her beauty to mysterious elixirs provided by her alchemists. Whether or not the stories are true, they reflect a cultural belief. Mercury was tied to beauty and the promise of eternal rule. In Japan, too, mercury and lead found their way into cosmetics. Court ladies of the Heian period used powders to whiten their skin. a sign of refinement and nobility. Diaries from the period describe women carefully applying layers of toxic makeup, believing it would protect them from blemishes and sun damage. The whiter and smoother the skin, the more aristocratic the woman appeared. Over time, the constant use of these powders left faces scarred, teeth blackened, and health ruined. Yet the practice continued, because to appear without it was worse than the suffering it caused. Archaeology has uncovered chilling evidence of just how deeply these practices were rooted. In several Chinese tombs, scientists have found pools of mercury sealed inside burial chambers. The most famous example is the tomb of Qin Shi Huang himself, described in ancient texts as containing rivers of mercury meant to mirror the stars and heavens. Tests of the soil around the tomb confirm abnormally high levels of the metal, suggesting that the legend may be true. These rivers of poison were meant to guarantee immortality in the afterlife. A final, tragic irony. To the people of Asia, mercury was more than a cosmetic. It was a link between the earthly and the divine, a way to capture heavenly beauty and bring it down to the human body. For queens and empresses, it was not simply makeup. It was survival, a tool to secure their place in a brutal political world where beauty could mean the difference between power and oblivion. In Europe, the obsession with beauty took a different but equally dangerous form. By the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, pale, flawless skin had become the ultimate symbol of nobility. A fair complexion meant that you did not labor under the sun, that you belonged to the ruling class, untouched by the hardships of ordinary life. To achieve this look, women turned to cosmetics made from deadly substances: lead, arsenic, and yes, mercury. Queen Elizabeth I of England became one of the most famous victims of this fashion. After surviving a bout of smallpox in her 20s, she was left with scars on her face. Determined to maintain her image as the Virgin Queen, she began applying a paste known as Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, sometimes enhanced with traces of mercury to add sheen. It created a dazzlingly pale mask, hiding every blemish, but it slowly destroyed her skin. Her hair thinned, her teeth blackened, and chroniclers whispered of her growing dependence on cosmetics. The more damage the poison did, the thicker the queen's layers of makeup became. Elizabeth was not alone. Across France, Italy, and Spain, noblewomen pursued similar rituals. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, was infamous for her interest in alchemy and potions. Some accounts suggest her perfumes and lotions were laced with mercury and arsenic, used not only for beauty, but sometimes for darker purposes. Rumors of poisonings surrounded her court. In Spain, nobles experimented with healing ointments that contained mercury, claiming they could cure skin diseases or restore youth, but in reality they only worsened the condition. The Renaissance also gave rise to a culture of portraiture, where artists immortalized rulers with smooth, pale faces. Behind the paintings, however, the reality was often grim. The subjects were covering disfigurement, scarring, or illness caused by the very cosmetics that made them appear divine. A queen might be remembered for her luminous beauty on canvas, even as her real body was deteriorating from the inside. To the women of European courts, the choice was brutal. Appear beautiful and risk death, or reveal the natural marks of age and risk disgrace, loss of influence, even abandonment. In a world where a queen's face could decide alliances, cosmetics became both armor and poison. The silver shimmer of mercury, the ghostly white of lead, the fragrance of exotic oils, these were the weapons of survival. And like all weapons, they carried a price. The tragedy of mercury was not only its presence in beauty rituals, but the slow, merciless way it destroyed those who used it. At first, the symptoms seemed subtle, almost invisible. A faint trembling in the hands, difficulty sleeping, sudden headaches. Courtiers dismissed these as signs of stress, the natural burdens of ruling. But in reality, the poison was already working its way into the blood, attacking the nervous system, spreading to every organ. Soon, the signs could no longer be ignored. Teeth blackened and rotted, gums swelled and bled. Hair fell out in clumps, leaving bald patches, hastily covered by wigs and veils. The skin itself turned grey and blotched, forcing women to apply even heavier layers of makeup. The irony was cruel. The very substance used to preserve beauty created flaws so horrific they demanded more of the same poison to hide them. The cycle was endless. More powder to cover the damage, more damage caused by the powder. But the most terrifying effects of mercury were not visible. They struck the mind. Chronic exposure caused paranoia, sudden bursts of rage, fits of hysteria, and eventually hallucinations. In the courts of Europe and Asia, stories spread of queens and noblewomen who seemed to fall into madness, pacing the halls at night, screaming at invisible enemies, or withdrawing into silence. Few understood the cause, but in hindsight, the fingerprints of mercury poisoning are everywhere. In Japan, courtiers recorded that noblewomen sometimes became reclusive, refusing to show themselves in public once their faces were scarred by toxic powders. In Europe, whispers surrounded Elizabeth I in her later years, when her temper became infamous and her appearance increasingly unnatural beneath thick layers of ceruse. Some historians suggest her behavior in old age bore the hallmarks of mercury exposure: anxiety, insomnia, and paranoia. What made it worse was the silence. Physicians of the time often promoted these very substances, believing they worked miracles. A queen could not question her doctor without admitting weakness, and so she continued the rituals, trusting that the cure was working even as it poisoned her. By the time the truth was visible, it was already too late. Mercury did not kill quickly. It lingered, dragging its victims through years of decline, stripping away beauty, health, and sanity. And yet, because power depended on appearance, many queens had no choice but to endure. They became prisoners of their own reflection, trapped in a cycle where every attempt to preserve life hastened death. To understand why queens and empresses trusted mercury despite its dangers, we must look at how people once viewed the substance itself. Today, we see mercury as a toxic heavy metal, but for centuries it was revered as something almost divine. It was unlike any other element, a metal that was liquid at room temperature, shimmering like molten silver, flowing as if alive. To ancient eyes, this was proof that mercury carried the secrets of a transformation, the very essence of life itself. In China, alchemists believed cinnabar and mercury held the key to immortality. They saw it as a bridge between earth and heaven, solid and liquid, mortal and divine. Texts described it as a gift from the gods, capable of purifying the soul while preserving youth. Emperors consumed mercury elixirs not as a gamble, but as an act of faith in cosmic order. For empresses and queens, applying mercury to the skin meant drawing down a fragment of that heavenly perfection. In the Islamic world, scholars of the Golden Age regarded mercury as the spirit of silver. They believed it embodied both masculine and feminine principles, making it the perfect material for alchemy. To them, mercury was the missing ingredient that could unite opposites, transform metals into gold, and grant eternal life. Physicians used it in medicines, sometimes sincerely, sometimes out of ambition, spreading the idea that mercury was not poison, but cure. Europe inherited these ideas through translated Arabic texts. By the Middle Ages, mercury was tied to astrology and magic. Alchemists linked it to the planet Mercury, the messenger of the gods, a symbol of speed and transformation. In their laboratories, mercury was everywhere. in elixirs, powders, and experiments with the philosopher's stone. If such men swore it could transform lead into gold, why wouldn't a queen believe it could transform her skin into something timeless? There was also the allure of symbolism. Mercury never rusted, never tarnished. It seemed eternal, unchanging, a metal outside the normal rules of decay. To rulers terrified of aging and death, this was irresistible. If Mercury itself could resist time, perhaps it could share its power with the human body. The glittering liquid became not just a substance, but a promise that time itself could be conquered. Of course, that promise was a lie. But it was a lie wrapped in wonder, endorsed by scholars, whispered by alchemists, reinforced by centuries of myth. And so queens and empresses placed their trust in a metal that gleamed like moonlight, never realizing that it would carry them to an early grave. Picture the scene, one last time. The queen steps into her marble bath, the silver surface rippling as though alive. Courtiers bow their heads, whispering that she has discovered the secret of eternal beauty. The liquid shines in the candlelight, dazzling, hypnotic. To her followers, it is proof of divine favor. To us, with centuries of hindsight, it is the face of death disguised as a miracle. What makes this story so haunting is the paradox at its core. These women sought to protect their beauty because beauty meant survival. They wanted youth to hold power, to inspire loyalty, to remain relevant in a world where one wrinkle could mean political downfall. Yet in their desperation to preserve life, they embraced the very substance that destroyed it. Every bath, every powder, every elixir was a step closer to decline. The weapon of beauty became the instrument of death. The tragedy of Mercury is more than a medical tale. It is a story about human fear, the fear of aging, of losing control, of facing mortality. From China to Europe, from empresses to queens, rulers turned to the glittering promise of a metal they did not understand because it told them what they wanted to hear, that time could be stopped, that youth could be eternal, that death itself could be postponed. But the truth was merciless. Mercury ravaged their bodies, stole their sanity, and left them shadows of the women they once were. And in the end, it did not grant them eternal youth. Only an early grave and the cruel memory of a beauty destroyed by poison. Today, their stories echo as both warning and mirror. We no longer bathe in Mercury, but the obsession with eternal youth remains. The potions have changed into surgeries, injections, and chemicals, but the fear is the same. We are still chasing immortality, still risking our bodies for the illusion of agelessness. History reminds us that the price of such illusions has always been high. So when we picture the queen in her silver bath, radiant and doomed, we are not only looking at the past, we are looking at ourselves, at the endless human struggle against time, and the madness it can inspire. History remembers not just nameless noblewomen who quietly poisoned themselves with cosmetics, but also rulers whose very power seemed bound to Mercury. Take the stories surrounding Empress Wu Zetian of China. Though she ruled with iron will and political genius, later chroniclers whispered that her lasting beauty into old age was the result of cinnabar potions. To her enemies, this became an explanation for her cruelty and paranoia, that she was not merely ruthless, but poisoned, her mind warped by the same elixirs that kept her face unnaturally smooth. Whether true or slander, the story endured because it fit the image. A woman so desperate to control time and power that she turned to alchemy itself. In Europe, Queen Elizabeth I became a legend of beauty, painted in portraits with skin as white as marble. But behind the mask of Venetian ceruse, the truth was uglier. Visitors to her court remarked that in her later years, her teeth were black, her hair thinned, and her face bore the marks of disease hidden under paint. To her people she was Gloriana, radiant and untouchable, but in private she was a prisoner of toxic cosmetics. Every day she prepared her face like armor, covering the scars left by the very substance that gave her the illusion of perfection. Other women were less fortunate. Some minor queens and princesses of Spain and Italy, less protected by myth, were openly mocked for their decaying appearances. Chroniclers described women whose lips swelled grotesquely, whose skin cracked under layers of white powder, whose laughter revealed ruined mouths. Yet these humiliations rarely led them to abandon their routines. To do so would mean stepping into public as visibly flawed, a death sentence for their influence at court. Better to suffer in secret, painted and perfumed, than admit defeat to time. Even beyond queens, the myth of Mercury touched ordinary aristocrats. In Japan, the practice of ohaguro, blackening the teeth, was sometimes combined with cosmetics containing lead and mercury. What began as a symbol of beauty and refinement led to rotting gums and illness. In China, wealthy courtesans used cinnabar in lip color, which gave their smiles a brilliant crimson glow, until the poison eroded their health. These women, too, became victims of a deadly cycle. Beauty demanded sacrifice, and Mercury was the altar on which it was offered. In all these tales runs the same thread, the dream of beauty unchanging, of youth eternal. And behind it, the same cruel reality, that the glittering liquid which promised life was quietly delivering death. Not everyone who witnessed these rituals of beauty was fooled by their glitter. Courtiers, physicians, and chroniclers often left behind hints of unease, describing the strange decline of queens and noblewomen who should have been at the height of their power. Some spoke cautiously, others turned their observations into scandalous whispers that spread across courts like wildfire. Medieval and Renaissance physicians, though limited in their understanding, sometimes noticed the link between toxic cosmetics and illness. A few warned that the white powders beloved by noblewomen corrupted the flesh, or ate into the skin. Yet those same doctors often prescribed similar treatments, either because they genuinely believed in Mercury's power, or because refusing a queen's demand was unthinkable. A physician who suggested that a ruler's favorite beauty secret was killing her risked not just his career, but his life. And so silence prevailed. Among courtiers, gossip filled the void. They saw queens with trembling hands, erratic tempers, and decaying features. To explain it, they turned to stories of curses, divine punishment, or witchcraft. In China, the decline of emperors and empresses who consumed cinnabar was often described as heaven withdrawing its mandate. In Europe, noblewomen who grew paranoid or reclusive were rumored to be haunted by sins, demons, or hidden illnesses. Few guessed that the true culprit was lying in the powders and paints they praised each day. Chroniclers added their own spin, sometimes turning poison into propaganda. Empress Wu Zetian's supposed use of cinnabar became a way for hostile writers to paint her as unnaturally preserved, her beauty the result of corruption rather than nature. Elizabeth Berg's heavy use of ceruse fed rumors that she was a walking corpse by the end of her reign, still ruling through illusion while her body rotted beneath layers of paint. These stories may have been exaggerated, but they captured a truth people sensed. The pursuit of eternal youth always came with a price. For the people who lived in these times, the decline of their queens was both tragedy and spectacle. They admired the dazzling portraits, sang praises of eternal beauty, yet whispered of madness, curses, and hidden rot. To them, it seemed that rulers who tried to outwit age were struck down not by poison but by fate itself, as though the gods punished those who dared to defy the natural order. If Mercury slowly destroyed the bodies of queens, art worked just as tirelessly to conceal the damage. In portraits, poems, and public celebrations, rulers were presented not as mortal women, but as timeless symbols of grace. Painters smoothed scars, erased blemishes, and turned pale, powder-covered faces into visions of divine perfection. The contrast between canvas and reality was enormous, yet it served its purpose, to reassure subjects and allies that their ruler remained radiant, untouched by time. Take Elizabeth I of England. By her final decades, she was plagued by illness, tooth decay, and hair loss, her face ravaged by years of toxic cosmetics. Yet in the famous Rainbow Portrait, painted around 1600, she appears almost supernatural. Her skin is alabaster white, her cheeks softly blushed, her hair fiery red, her gown covered in symbols of power and purity. To her subjects, this was Gloriana, the eternal Virgin Queen. To those who knew her in private, it was a mask hiding decline. In China, too, empresses were immortalized in scrolls that highlighted elegance, youth, and serenity. Court artists had no choice but to obey. Their livelihood depended on it. To paint an empress as she truly appeared, with pockmarks or graying hair, would have been an insult punishable by disgrace, even death. And so, across dynasties, portraits became less historical record and more propaganda, presenting a perfection that never truly existed. Poets played a similar role. They compared rulers to the moon, to flowers that never faded, to goddesses untouched by time. These verses circulated widely, ensuring that the official image of a queen was one of everlasting beauty. Yet behind closed doors, courtiers could see the truth. Trembling hands, nervous fits, and skin cracking under layers of toxic paint. Art celebrated an ideal. Life revealed the horror beneath it. This tension between appearance and reality made the myth even stronger. Ordinary people, who rarely saw their rulers in person, believed the portraits and poems. They were convinced their queen or empress had defied age, that she truly was blessed with supernatural beauty. Only a few insiders knew that the miracle was purchased with pain, poison, and slow decay. Thus, Mercury's deadliest trick was not only its effect on the body, but its ability to create illusions. With the help of artists and poets, it convinced generations that rulers were living gods, while in truth, the poison was already dragging them to an early grave. When queens and empresses began to wither under the slow poison of Mercury, the people around them often refused to see it as simple illness. To a world steeped in superstition, the decline of great rulers became a story of divine punishment. Chroniclers, priests, and poets wrapped their suffering in layers of myth, transforming their agony into cautionary tales whispered for generations. In Europe, the whitening powders that scarred the skin and rotted the teeth were rarely blamed directly. Instead, whispers spread that God himself was striking down rulers who had grown too proud. Elizabeth I's late-life reclusion, when she locked herself away and refused to be seen without her thick mask of paint, became legend, a once mighty queen who clung so fiercely to her image that heaven cursed her vanity. Some even claimed she turned into a living ghost, her beauty an illusion concealing decay. In Asia, similar legends grew around emperors and their consorts who consumed cinnabar elixirs. When they collapsed into madness or died young, stories claimed it was heaven withdrawing its favor. In the case of Wu Zetian, later critics described her supposed use of cinnabar not as a medical error, but as a symbol of her corruption, that her unnatural beauty and long rule were the results of poison, and that her eventual death was punishment from above. Fact and slander blurred until the myth became inseparable from the woman. In Japan, The sight of noblewomen whose cosmetics left them scarred and sickly also took on a moral meaning. Popular tales described them as cautionary examples, women who had sought too much refinement and been punished for arrogance. To the common people, their suffering became proof that beauty, when pursued too desperately, invited ruin. What all these legends had in common was their message. They turned the real effects of mercury poisoning, trembling, madness, rotting flesh, into moral lessons about pride, vanity, and the dangers of defying nature. Instead of recognizing that queens were victims of ignorance and bad science, people remembered them as warnings, as women who reached too far and were struck down for it. And so the truth was buried under myth. What might have been recognized as poisoning became a story of curses and punishment. The queens themselves were forgotten as human beings and remembered instead as symbols, their suffering twisted into parables of vanity and sin. Looking back at the stories of queens bathing in mercury, it is tempting to dismiss them as relics of a superstitious past. But the uncomfortable truth is that the obsession driving those women has not vanished. It has only changed its form. The desire to stop time, to preserve beauty at any cost, still dominates our culture today. We may no longer grind cinnabar into powders or pour mercury into royal baths, but the tools of modern vanity are no less invasive. Consider the rise of Botox, a toxin derived from one of the deadliest bacteria known to science. Injected into the face in carefully measured doses, it paralyzes muscles to smooth away wrinkles. Like mercury, it offers a dazzling illusion of youth, a mask that hides the passage of time. And like mercury, it is a poison, used willingly in the name of beauty. The same paradox remains. To look younger, we embrace something that in another context would be feared as deadly. Plastic surgery tells a similar story. For some, it is a tool of empowerment. For others, it becomes an endless cycle of procedures. The more one tries to chase the perfect image, the more the body is cut, stretched, injected. Just as queens of the past layered on toxic powders to hide the damage caused by those very powders, today many find themselves trapped in a loop where each correction creates new flaws to be corrected again. The faces in magazines and on screens become the modern equivalent of portraits painted by court artists, masks of perfection, hiding scars both physical and emotional. Even cosmetics, though far safer than their medieval counterparts, are not entirely free of risk. Heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, and untested chemicals still make their way into the beauty market. Most consumers do not think twice, just as queens once trusted their alchemists. The packaging may be sleek, the science more advanced, but the underlying impulse is the same: the refusal to accept that time moves forward. What links the queens of the past to us today is not the specific poison, but the fear behind it. The fear of wrinkles, of aging, of being seen as less valuable once youth has faded. For a queen, that fear was political, even existential. For us, it is social and cultural, but the drive is identical: to hold on to an image of eternal youth, no matter the price. When we look back at the queens who used mercury, it is easy to see their choices as reckless or foolish, but their desperation was not born from vanity alone. Beauty was a language of power, and for women in positions of influence, it was often their most effective weapon. A flawless face could silence rivals, inspire loyalty, and reassure allies. A single wrinkle could invite whispers of weakness, make powerful men look for younger brides, and shift the delicate balance of politics. In such a world, cosmetics were not simply decoration. They were survival. The tragedy was that this survival strategy demanded sacrifice. By embracing mercury, queens traded years of health for a few fleeting seasons of radiance. They paid with their bodies, their sanity, and often their lives. What makes their story haunting is the way fear turned them into prisoners. The very image they sought to preserve became the cage that trapped them. They could not step away from the rituals without risking disgrace, and so they doubled down, layer after layer, sip after sip, until the poison consumed them completely. This tension between beauty and destruction reveals something deeper about humanity itself. Across time and culture, people have feared aging because it confronts us with mortality. The queens of China and Europe, surrounded by wealth and power, were no different from anyone else in that fear. They only had more tools and more pressure to fight it. Their story is not simply about rulers lost to poison, but about a universal struggle, the desire to hold on to youth, to deny the inevitability of decay. And so the Mercury rituals become more than historical curiosities. They are mirrors. When we inject toxins into our faces today, when we carve and stretch our bodies in search of perfection, we are echoing the same impulses. We may use different substances, more advanced science, but the underlying story remains unchanged. We chase immortality, and in the process, we risk destroying ourselves. In this light, the tale of the queens and their silver baths is not just about the past. It is about us, about the timeless battle between the human spirit and the march of time. Picture the queen, one final time. The chamber glows with the soft light of candles, the air thick with the perfume of incense and oils. She lowers herself into the marble bath, and the silver surface ripples as though alive. Courtiers bow, whispering of miracles, convinced they are witnessing the secret of eternal beauty. To them she is radiant, untouchable, a woman who has cheated time. But beneath the shimmering surface, poison is already working its slow destruction. Her body trembles, her teeth loosen, her mind begins to cloud. She believes she is preserving life, yet every bath pulls her closer to death. This is the image that lingers, not simply as a curiosity from history, but as a symbol of the human struggle against time. The queens who turned to Mercury were not madwomen or fools. They were human beings caught in a web of fear, power, and expectation. They lived in worlds where beauty was survival, where aging meant decline, where every wrinkle carried political consequences. They reached for what seemed like salvation, and instead found ruin. Their story reminds us that the pursuit of eternal youth has always been dangerous, always been costly. It shows how illusions can become prisons, how the desire to preserve life can lead us to embrace death. And it forces us to ask a question. How different are we today? Our tools have changed, but our fears remain the same. We still cling to illusions of agelessness, still risk our bodies for an image, still whisper promises that time can be conquered. The queen in her Mercury bath is more than a figure of the past. She is a mirror. She reflects the timeless human refusal to accept what we cannot change. She reminds us that the glitter of eternal youth is often nothing more than the shimmer of poison. And she warns us, across centuries, that those who believe they can master time will discover that time masters all,